All right, we are officially live. So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone here. Welcome Dan, and thanks a lot for joining us. This is the Viking Codecast, and we're doing this as a service to all of our students and anyone else who's interested in learning how to code to bring in professional developers and have them get a chance to talk to us and provide some of the wisdom that was hard won over their years a little bit easier on the path to you guys. Just as a little bit of an introduction to what we're doing here at Viking, Viking is an online immersive program that teaches professional software engineering. We have right now we're running an immersive program where we have a group of wonderful students who you see among us, and as well a flexible program that's a part-time program that takes people from essentially advanced beginner to employable software engineering. And we have a group of students from around the country and around the world, and we're all really excited to learn software engineering, and everyone's in various stages of their journey, and I think that we have a lot to say here today, specifically Dan with your particular skill sets, that I think everyone can learn from. So that's kind of about us. Dan, I'd be really grateful if you could kind of describe a little bit about sort of who you are and what's gotten you to where you are today, and kind of carry this forward from there.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, firstly, thanks so much for having me. I'm really very passionate about talking about technology and code, and particularly with people that are just kind of starting out on their journeys. I think there's actually a big challenge globally right now where the world doesn't have enough coders, and that's not a problem that we're going to solve anytime soon. So it's inspiring to see people kind of decide to pursue it as a career, or at the very least, add it as a tool to their toolkit. Because I think it can be very empowering to know how to code. So my personal background, I've been coding for over 20 years now. Not all of that professionally, probably about 14 or 15 years professionally. I started coding as a teenager, and this is it's kind of hard to imagine now, but when I started coding, there was no internet access, so I didn't have internet connectivity at home. I had an old like MS-DOS computer, and I learned how to program using an old language called QBasic. Anyone who's over 30 may know that, but if you're not over 30, you probably haven't heard of it, and even then, probably not. It was kind of Microsoft's first consumer coding language back in the day, and I learned how to code from help files, believe it or not, because lacking internet access and lacking any kind of resources, it was very difficult. But somehow I managed to become, I guess, semi-competent, and I really enjoyed making games and a little kind of graphical apps and musical apps and things like that. Super simple compared to what we can do now. But anyway, I finished school and I went and studied electronic engineering here in Australia, a university called the University of Adelaide, which is quite a good institution here. And as much as I loved electronics, I was continuously brought back to this idea of software engineering. And so I ended up getting a job, sadly, before I graduated, which is kind of a double-edged sword, right? I was, as a student, living from week to week on beans and toast. I wanted something a bit more fruitful in terms of a salary, so I jumped at the opportunity when I was offered a job. And I had every intention of going back and completing my studies. I never did. So, but back in those days, there was nothing like Viking. So it was college or nothing, right? But anyway, I got this job, and a few years in, I had this crazy idea that I wanted to do a startup. And so a friend of mine and I got together, and we created a company called NetFox, which was essentially a tool to help get better internet access in high schools. So this was kind of the first few years of ADSL internet connectivity in Australia. And so we did pretty well with that business actually for a while. We built a team, we built some really interesting technology. We raised some money, built it to around 300 schools in our jurisdiction. But sadly, we, being young entrepreneurs, we got distracted, and we kind of didn't keep it together, and we lost focus, and ultimately, sadly enough, the business failed. But it was a huge lesson for me. I see my experience doing a startup as way more valuable than anything I learned in school. All the things I learned in school were really important, and they kind of set the foundations. But those lessons in a startup and learning some of the technical challenges and the people challenges and the marketing challenges and all the rest of it was super valuable to me. So then, despite the fact it failed, we went out together, my business partner and I, and we did another one, another startup. And this time it was a little lower risk. It was a software development agency. And we started building applications using Ruby on Rails in particular, sort of in the dawn of the Ruby era back in about 2008. And we started working with all sorts of different companies in some of the big cities in Australia. And that business, thankfully, was much more successful, and we exited that in 2012. But once again, that took my understanding of the technology industry and how technology and code relate to people and kind of real world problems. It took that understanding to a whole new level. And so since then, I've been taking a variety of different roles. I was the Chief Technology Officer for a digital marketing company here in Australia, and then I actually spent some time in New York. I was actually the Chief Technology Officer at an airline startup based in Manhattan. And that was a very challenging but very exciting business to be a part of. Now I'm back in Australia and based in Sydney. And I'm consulting. This is about as far away as you could get from a startup, but I'm consulting for the Australian federal government, which has a whole new set of challenges. But it's actually really interesting to see how different people's perspectives on technology are in a startup, a customer of a startup, versus say a public servant working for a government. And I think it's one of the pieces of advice that I give to people wanting to learn to code is don't put yourself into one kind of silo. Make sure you go out and try different roles. The great thing about being a coder in this modern era is that there are plenty of opportunities for you in lots of different walks of life, and I think you become more rounded as a person, more rounded as a developer when you try different things. You try different industries, you work with different teams, you work with different kind of philosophical outlooks on how technology should be used. I think you become a much better person in general to do that. And I feel like I've grown. I probably still have a lot more growing to do, but it's been an exciting journey so far.
That sounds fantastic. I'm loaded up with questions here to ask you. But in the same vein, actually, I wanted to let everyone know that this is really driven by you. It's driven by you guys here. It's driven by everyone who's watching outside. There is for the people in here, you guys are welcome to just sort of unmute yourselves and ask questions whenever you feel like it. For everyone who's outside, there's a little Q&A app that runs alongside the Hangouts on Air. It might be on your top bar, it might be on your sidebar, and I'm gonna enable that if I can make that work. And then you guys should be able to ask questions as well. For anyone who's available on our Slack channel or on Twitter, you guys are welcome to ask questions there too. This is definitely driven by you guys, so feel free to participate as much as you'd like. Just to kind of kick things off, first of all, I do want to say again, thank you, Dan, for joining us. And one of the things that I just kind of that occurred to me when you were describing learning in the early phases is that obviously nowadays we have an entirely different set of tools for teaching coding and for learning how to code. And as someone who's worked with a number of developers over the years and hired developers over the years, I'm actually kind of curious if maybe there are some of those really hard-won lessons that you got from the experience of having to learn from manuals and having to learn without the benefit of Stack Overflow or without the internet or without interactive Codecademy-style tutorials that maybe taught you some things that perhaps these days aren't quite so or isn't quite such common sense anymore, because people haven't had to learn that way. Have you found that at all? Yeah, certainly. I mean, so what's interesting,
while I first learned to code when I was a teenager back in the mid-90s, and things were very different there. Obviously, like you said, I didn't have internet access. I don't feel like I've ever really stopped learning. So, I learned BASIC as my first language, and then I learned, I think next it was this obscure language called Ada. And then I learned Java, and then C, C++, C#, then of course Ruby, JavaScript, and a number of others along the way. And every time you come across a new language, the process gets a little easier, because what you find is you become better at learning. The more you practice something, the better you get at it. And I think where a lot of developers go wrong is they kind of learn a language. Let's say it's Ruby for argument's sake. And they say, hey, yes, I can code. I know Ruby now. And they kind of just sit on that, and maybe they get really, really good at Ruby, and they become like an expert in that domain. But then they kind of forget how to learn new stuff. And if that goes on for too long, it can be really, really hard to break out of that. And what happens in 10, 15 years' time when Ruby is no longer the language that everybody's using? By the way, it's a great language to learn right now, and probably will be for a while. But further down the track, there's going to be something else. And so if you don't continue to learn and embrace new technologies and try new things out, I think you can fall behind really, really quickly. And it will probably happen without you realizing it. The other thing that I would say is that when you're learning something, rather than just taking the academic approach and kind of going, I just want to learn X, Y, and Z, I know that I want to try to get through this book or this manual, rather than doing that, pick something specific that you actually want to build. So I want to build this thing, whether it's a game or an app or a website or a blog or whatever the case may be. Pick something that you want to build. And then focus your learning around finding the things that allow you to build that thing. And then you'll find that because you have purpose in your learning, you'll find that you retain information much better. And it also, whenever you kind of get stuck, whenever you feel like you're falling off track or you're not quite sure what the next steps are, you can always go back to what is it I'm actually trying to build? What's the next step in building that thing? And it really, really helps you focus your learning and helps you become a better coder in the process.
Absolutely.
Are you still there, Erik? Oh, okay, right. Sorry, I lost your camera.
Okay. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. That learning by building is the most powerful force that we found that I found personally in my own learning, and that we found with our students as well. It's something that you can't hear enough. It's sort of commonly offered but rarely taken advice, because I think one of the common refrains is typically, I don't know what to build. How do I figure out what I'm supposed to build? It sounded like you just went out and built a startup.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing about being an entrepreneur is that actually in many ways the code came second. So I had this idea and I wanted to do this idea, and I at that time I had some level of coding experience, but not a great deal. And I needed to work out how to build this thing. So the coding almost came secondary to what it is I wanted to achieve. And so I think that's where a lot of coders probably go wrong. They're kind of not clear on what their purpose is. What do they actually want to do? What do they want to achieve? Who do they want to work for? What kind of apps do they want to build? Kind of get that in your mind right first. And then the learning, although it will still be challenging, learning to code is not easy. It will be much more straightforward once you know which path you want to go down.
Oh, totally. Well, so what about? There's always a choice after you've gotten to the point where in theory you're employable as a software engineer, in terms of what am I going to do next? Am I gonna join a big company? Am I gonna join a consultancy? Am I gonna join a startup, or am I gonna start a startup, or am I gonna just freelance? There's this whole range of options. And again, you've obviously taken one of those, and no doubt seen people throughout your career who have taken other paths. And I'm kind of curious, maybe if you have any advice around perhaps the right factors to optimize for when students are making that decision around sort of what should that first or second step forward be after you've started building up a reasonably valuable skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few things to talk about there. I mean, it does depend largely on what kind of a person you are and how big a risk you want to take, and also how motivated you are. The thing that I say to most developers when they're first starting out is find a big enough team that has the time and the resources to mentor you and to guide you. One of the big challenges is after doing it. How long is the Viking course? 16 weeks, right? Yeah. So 16 weeks. I mean, that might seem like a long time, and I know you folks are about halfway through that now. It probably feels like a long time until you're going to complete, because you're working so hard and you're absorbing so much information. But really, 16 weeks is not all that much time. And I think as amazing as I'm sure the Viking school is, once you graduate, there's only so much that you're going to have kind of ingrained into your abilities and knowledge. And I think you really have to keep learning. You have to keep surrounding yourself with people from who you can learn. And going into a team that has the bandwidth to provide that assistance for you is really, really important. That said, it's not strictly required. If you wanted to go and start your own business or start a startup or join a small team, that's absolutely doable. What you have to remember in that situation, though, is that you need to be prepared to put in extra hours of work. You need to go and look at screencasts online, or maybe try committing to an open source project and find some mentors in the open source community, or get along to some meetups. There's plenty of Ruby and JavaScript meetups in every major city in the world, and find some mentors and compatriots in that regard. I think that's hugely advantageous.
So definitely optimizing for learning is something that we talk quite a bit about when we're having the career discussions. I am pretty interested in specifically the difference between joining a team and well, let's see, how do I phrase this? One thing that you'd mentioned was come up with a project and work backwards and essentially do what it takes to build that project. But then sort of the far extension of that is that project is itself a company. Working on a project and learning up to a project is almost like a bite-sized version of the eventual I'm going to go out and build a company. But a lot of what you hear from people who have had to be self-taught to the degree that they've actually had to level themselves up while learning companies, that they feel like there are a number of gaps in their skill sets versus if they'd sort of joined a team. And I'm kind of interested in your perspective on when you get up, like what that transition point looks like from I'm going to build stuff on my own, or kind of use a project as a guidance for my learning, and then I'm going to step onto a team and let them help push me up. Like what is the appropriate balance between those two factors?
Yeah, I understand. I don't know that there's an appropriate balance necessarily. I mean, everybody's different, but I think I can share my own experiences, and those experiences may help others, along their journey. I actually don't think that my experience was the best example, and the reason I say that is because I only really worked for about maybe 18 months after I left college before I decided to make a startup. And one thing, I didn't realize this at the time, but I didn't really have very much strong mentorship when I was working in the corporate world, and so I went into my startup pretty blind. Of course, at that young age and with that much enthusiasm, I probably didn't think I was blind at all. I probably had so much confidence and belief in my own abilities, nothing could stop me, and that's an amazing thing. Don't get me wrong, but I think if I had my time again, I would have spent a couple more years in the tech space. I would have probably changed companies and moved to a company that was able to provide me some of that mentorship and learning, and try to understand a bit more about how tech works in teams, how you negotiate with customers or stakeholders, and how you elicit user requirements, a whole bunch of kind of really important stuff around Agile and Scrum. None of that stuff I knew from the beginning, and it took me quite a while to work it out. There's nothing to say that you folks as students won't work that stuff out, but I think there's a lot of value in spending just a couple of years working for a bigger company and try to accelerate that learning a bit. I think that's probably my recommendation. If you can do that. It doesn't mean that's the only way, but it's probably going to be the best way, I think, in many cases.
Does anyone have any questions, by the way? Make sure your voices are heard.
So I think, is the Q&A on the right-hand side here disabled still?
Yeah, it appears to be. I was trying to set that up, but it looks like the feature is disabled. So if anyone who's outside of here would like to ask a question, you're welcome to do so in the Google Plus event where this link is actually provided. We'll pick that up. If you're in here...
So apparently the chat works, so we can try the chat.
Yeah, and so if you're in here, feel free to drop questions in the chat. Otherwise, one thing that we're hoping to focus on today was some semblance of maybe some of the softer side of the softer skills that are necessary to actually be successful as a developer. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about code, a lot of time talking about hard skills, but at the end of the day, as a breathing, functioning human, you've obviously got a whole lot of other things going on. And if you're just optimizing for learning code all day, every day, you're going to crash and burn, and it's going to be a problem. In particular, you've clearly lived a number of different iterations of your career through some pretty crazy environments, and I'm definitely kind of curious to hear your thoughts around how to kind of keep yourself whole, keep yourself balanced, and keep yourself moving forward when the macro factors are all sort of aligned against you.
Yeah, certainly. So I have lots of stories to share, but let me start with one story. I remember in my first startup, this was we actually had a very early stage release out. Some customers were using it, and it was working reasonably well. But they'd been screaming at us for new features, and we knew we had to release a new version. And so my business partner, he was kind of the sales guy. He set up an event where we were going to launch this product, and we thought this was a great idea. You know, being probably a young, overconfident young man, I thought, well, I can smash this out in no time. This is going to be straightforward. And so we put a fairly ambitious date on the launch, and lots of companies were excited about it. We had quite a big turnout, and so it was turning out to be quite a big thing, right? 1 week to go before the launch, I realized just how much work I had to do, and I had one other developer working for me at that time, and he got sick, like a really, really bad flu. So here I was on my own, and so we were talking about Red Bull before. I don't actually drink Red Bull anymore, but this week I drank gallons of Red Bull, and I actually did over 100-hour week that week, which I don't recommend. Maybe if you're a student, you've done 100-hour weeks before. We actually got the product done. We got it out. And on the Sunday afternoon prior to the launch was Monday morning. On the Sunday late evening, I guess it was, I actually said to my business partner, "Can you take me home because I can't drive? I can't even see 1 foot in front of my face." I was utterly exhausted, and it took me probably 2 weeks really to fully recover from that. And so what I learned throughout that process was sustainability is actually way more important than just output. You can have this huge spike in output, but generally speaking, what goes up must come down. And I've seen this pattern repeated over and over and over. And it's a very easy pattern to fall into. I think where a lot of developers go wrong is they get into what I call the hero coder syndrome. So a hero coder is someone, maybe she's got a particularly difficult problem to solve, and maybe she's gotten stuck along the way, but for whatever reason, the solution isn't quite getting there, but she just doesn't want to give up. And you kind of get up to this barrier where you're not making any progress, but you don't want to give up either, and so you end up spending 18, 20 hours in one stint. And it can be incredibly frustrating. And I would hazard a guess that those of you that are learning to code would probably understand this. It can be incredibly frustrating. And here's the most important piece of advice I can give you, which sounds totally counterintuitive and can be quite hard to do. You have to be very disciplined. The best thing to do in that situation is get up and walk away from the computer, and stay away from the computer for a while if you can. Go for a walk, go see some friends, go out to dinner, do whatever you got to do. And 9 times out of 10 that I do that, I'll be away from my computer for a couple of hours, and then all of a sudden something will pop into my head, and I'll have the solution, and then I can rush back, and all of a sudden I've solved the problem. So I think that's probably a really important thing. So sustainability, and don't force yourself to stay in front of the computer. Walk away.
Yeah, I think one thing that we do talk about a reasonable amount is sort of having a meta-awareness of yourself. We talk about it in terms of the learning process on one end, but then there's also kind of the the coding and work side of things too. I mean, so the way that we talk about it is in terms of understanding your sleep patterns, understanding trying to get an understanding for when are you a little bit more creative, when are you a little bit more active, but also when are you starting to burn down. That I think having that awareness both on a short-term basis and a long-term basis is really important. Because you can bang out some pretty amazing stuff in a pretty short period of time if you're caffeine fueled and sort of you have the momentum and you're ready to go with it. But there is definitely a point where I mean even on an individual day basis, I mean I can't necessarily speak for anyone else, but I can speak for myself that I certainly will get to a point where I've gone from reason to obsession. And there's kind of this fine line between being highly motivated and being obsessed. And this will happen late at night or early in the morning after a really, really long session when there's some problem that just isn't solving itself. And it's like you kind of just end up banging and banging and banging and banging. And you have to get to the end. And it's just a lack of meta-awareness where actually sometimes when you finally get to the point 4 hours too late that you should have actually stopped and gone to bed. You end up waking up in the morning and realizing 9 times out of 10 you just throw away everything you wrote the last night anyway.
That's right. It's a tough balance to strike sometimes because I find what happens if I force myself to walk away and let's say I just go to bed and try to get some sleep. Sometimes I'll lay in bed thinking about the problem and then I won't get any sleep. So even though going to bed and getting some sleep might be the best solution for you, sometimes it's pretty challenging. And so in those cases, I'll usually go and do something just totally unrelated to technology, even though it's late and I should be sleeping. I'll watch a movie or play a game of cards or just something. It's whatever can kind of take your mind off it. Actually, while I think of it, there's another thing that I should mention, and this is not something that I learned until much later in my career. It's actually not just, I like the way you talk about the meta-awareness. I think that's really important. But it's also, what's the awareness and understanding of the people who are close to you? So if you've got a partner, a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or your family or friends, they kind of need to have some sort of empathy for what it is you're doing. And if they're not a coder, they may struggle to understand why you need some quiet space and why you need to lock in and just not engage in conversation for a couple of hours while you try to work on some code. And I find that just kind of sitting them down and explaining to them what it is I'm doing and kind of coaching them on what it is I do and setting up times of the day where I don't get any interruption and they know, okay, Dan's working, let's just leave him alone and do his thing. That can actually be hugely valuable as well, and it makes for happier relationships when, if you're not in the middle of a problem and somebody interrupts you and you get upset because you've lost your train of thought or whatever. It's another interesting life skill, I think.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that there's been a lot of really interesting research as well around the idea of sort of maker schedules and manager schedules, and the need for people like developers to really get long and uninterrupted stretches of time, right? Because I mean, you sort of get into a flow, you get into a momentum, and then one interruption, and all of a sudden the wave comes in and washes away your sandcastle, and you have to start all over again. And I think there is actually a really important, I mean, especially if you work in a mixed workplace or in a mixed home, that you do end up actually educating the people around you. Specifically, again, like in the workplace, this might end up being your manager. This might end up being a product manager or people on the sales team or anyone in your open office plan, which developers absolutely hate. That it's kind of like headphones on means I need to be uninterrupted and focused. I think that sort of one thing that I've noticed a lot of is you really need to have sort of fight for your ability to produce. Just by being quiet and assuming that people understand what you're going through is not always the best way of is rarely the best way of going through things like that.
Yeah, actually, I just noticed. I totally agree with that. I just noticed that Sia mentioned. I think the research basically says it's similar to endurance sports training. You need recovery time for your brain to recover and find new connections. I totally agree with that. Anecdotally, I feel that that's definitely applies to me. If I push myself for too long, then not only does it take a long time to recover and feel motivated again, but I can't concentrate as well. I find that I'm not able to solve problems as easily. So it's, imagine if you tried to run for, 8 or 10 or 15 hours a day, every day, your running would be appalling by the end of it, I'm sure. So yeah, that's a great point, Sia. Thank you.
Yeah. And actually, I'd like to open it up again. You guys, please feel free to ask questions.
I do have a quick question, actually. Looking at where the industry is moving, considering it's always changing, you were talking earlier how it's a good idea to always be learning new languages rather than letting yourself be pigeonholed into a single language. How do you feel about, rather than finding that single big corporation as your first job, something like contract work or something that doesn't tie you down? Is it more dangerous to do something like that straight out of school? Or is it a good idea because then it kind of forces you into something new as soon as your contract's up?
That's a really interesting question. It was Jeffrey, was it? Yeah, thank you. So, look, once again, I preface this by saying that this advice doesn't apply to everybody. Not everybody has to fit this mold. But I would say, generally speaking, to go into a contract role very early in your career will be pretty challenging, especially if unless you're going through like an agency and that agency has other developers or engineers or product managers or whatever to support you. If you're dealing directly with a client, I think that can be incredibly challenging. Even if you are really experienced, that can be very challenging work. It can be very rewarding. The whole idea of being a digital nomad and going to Bermuda and working for a month in Bermuda for some client in New York, that's such a cool idea. But the reality is that a lot of customers, especially if they're not very technical themselves, have very, very high expectations of what a contract developer is going to be able to do. And you really do need a decent amount of experience to kind of navigate some of those challenges, because you've not just got very, very high expectations on the technical side. These customers will often expect you to know, probably way more than anybody that's been working in the industry for a couple of years knows. But the other challenge, of course, is that you have all these other issues, like making sure they pay you on time, making sure that you understand the scope of the project. Are you going to work in an agile fashion, or are you going to fall back to the old waterfall style? And a lot of customers, if they've not been exposed to technology before, will try to get you to commit to a specific scope for a specific fee in a specific time frame. And that's generally pretty much impossible to achieve. Out of those three things that you're working on, scope, cost, and time frame, usually you can only meet two of them. That means that in some cases you have to kind of negotiate with your client to understand what it is you're going to be building, how long it's going to take, and what it might cost. And that's something that takes some experience to be able to do as well. So there's all these kind of additional meta skills when you start going out and contracting on your own. And I think the other really important thing about contracting on your own kind of comes back to what I said before. You don't have a support network, or at least it's much more difficult to get a support network. You really have to go an extra mile to find people in the community or people online to help support you if you need help with anything, and that can be much more difficult. So like I said, that's not necessarily advice for everybody, but I think it can be pretty challenging to be a sole contractor right out of the gate.
It's a good question.
Yeah, great question.
I have a question. So I see that you're working on a diversity documentary. Do you have any advice for new developers, really of any culture or gender, to make sure they don't exit early or basically give up because of either diversity, gender issues, or just basically poor work culture issues?
Wow, that's a big question, and it's a really tough one to answer. I've been so just for everyone else's benefit, the documentary that Sia is referring to is a documentary project I'm working on with some other folks called Debugging Diversity. It's a topic that I've been working on for a couple of years, and it might seem a little strange that a white male is working on a project about diversity. But what I've realized is that the vast majority of the industry at the moment, sadly, is made up of white male software developers. And while that's not ideal, it's definitely a challenge. I think for the most part, people working in the industry, want to do the right thing. They have really good intentions. I just think that very often they don't realize that their own cognitive biases or their own behavior actually can have a very detrimental effect on other members in the organization. So to come to your question, as hard as it can be, sometimes when you're entering a new organization and you perhaps do come up against those challenges, maybe there's some sexist comments being made, maybe there's some racist comments being made, or in some way people are not being inclusive and accepting of the different members of their teams. I think it's okay to call them out on that, but of course you need to be very diplomatic about it. Sometimes it can require going to a more senior manager and just having a very confidential, carefully worded conversation. Or sometimes, if you think it's appropriate and if you're comfortable doing so, by all means approach the person with whom you have the problem. And I would wager that most of the time that person hasn't done this stuff intentionally. They've been totally oblivious to it. I've been around a lot of guys, white guys over the years that say really stupid things. But then you kind of call them out and they're like, oh, wow, yeah, actually, I didn't really mean it like that. I shouldn't say things like that. And maybe they take a step back and they sort of look at themselves and realize that behavior is not appropriate and not acceptable. So, of course, on the flip side, sometimes there are people that really do have horrendous beliefs, and saying something to them probably won't have any effect. You need to be very careful of those people. They're usually pretty easy to identify. And if there is somebody that is on your team or you're working closely with someone like that, then sometimes the best thing to do is just distance you from them. But I think, like I said, for the most part, I think people generally have good intentions, and helping them understand their own behavior or their own challenges, I think is a really important step to take. It does take courage, so I can understand it's hard, but I certainly encourage you to do so. So I hope that answers your question.
I know at least what's worked for me in other industries, because I have a little bit more experience than most of the people on the call, and I think it probably works the same here. But for certain situations where it could be more confrontational to talk to someone directly, sometimes it helps to actually have champions, basically, that do work better, and maybe the other person would actually listen to them more because they have either a longer relationship, or maybe it's like man to man.
Yeah.
So listen to the man first, and then just basically starting to get inserted in there, and then over time they start to learn. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think people need role models. People need people that they trust, and those people are usually the people that they will accept advice from. And in the diversity kind of problem space, if you like, we need champions of all backgrounds and all walks of life, and it has to be men and women and people of different kind of ethnic backgrounds and religions. So I think it's important to try to find those champions. I think that's a really great suggestion.
Oh, and I do want to point out that, there's clearly an issue with women and just general ethnic diversity. But I do think also, or at least from what I've seen, mostly from the outside in, although maybe I see a little bit more here in New Orleans because we do have a pretty open community. But it seems like there's also this stereotype of I watched a really good, I don't know, I guess it was a talk. I don't know what conference it was. Maybe a Python conference or something, and this guy was talking about this myth of the brilliant programmer, right? And it actually hurts everyone because it makes it seem like everyone's at this really high level, or the people that are left, when really it's a bell curve. There are average programmers, there are great ones, and then there's poor ones. And so this myth of the excellent programmer kind of it makes it okay to kind of be a jerk or whatever, because all these people are really smart programmers. But it would be interesting to see how to get beyond that, or to bring I mean, it probably varies a lot by company, but it would be interesting to see what are some good ways to try to break that cultural myth in organizations that do have that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is interesting because it's kind of touching on some of the stuff that I want to achieve in the documentary. I think education is a big part of it, and I don't just mean education within the technology space and kind of preaching to the converted, as it were, but I also mean helping the larger public community understand what coding actually is all about. That it's actually not this hyper intelligent, you have to be in the 0.001% of the population to even understand. There are certainly some elements of the software industry that fit in that category, but they are such a tiny little piece of it. But the vast majority of people, I think, can learn how to code. And I think that coding is I honestly believe that in 50 years' time, it'll be like reading and writing is now. I think most people will have at least some basic ability to program a computer. And I think that making sure that it's not an easy thing to do, but helping the community at large to understand that it's really not that big a deal to learn how to code. It's a creative passion. It's a creative pursuit. You definitely have to have a little bit of kind of critical thinking, but you certainly don't have to be a genius, and you, by all means, don't have to be some kind of almighty jerk, basically, which is, I think, how a lot of Hollywood and media and so forth portray it, which is absolutely wrong, if you ask me. I think that it's not an easy problem to solve, but that's certainly part of it.
It also seems like one of the potential major downsides of the brilliant programmer syndrome is that you end up fostering workplaces where people also feel trapped by that idea, in that they can't show weakness, that they can't ask for help, they can't admit when they're wrong. And I'm actually a little bit curious about maybe from your perspective, Dan, having managed workplaces and been in workplaces, how do you make sure that there's a culture in place where it's okay to be wrong, where it's okay to ask questions, and where it's okay to be open about the fact that we're all growing and that you never stop learning? Yeah,
well, in a word, I'd say empathy. It's really, really important to have empathy for your fellow team members. Now, I had an interesting story from many years ago. This was quite early in my startup days, so I like to think that I handled it reasonably well. I probably would have handled it differently had it happened now. But I had a developer on my team who was a young man. He was one of those kind of inverted commas brilliant coders. He was a very, very good coder. In the traditional idea of that term. But actually he had terrible social skills. He had some anger management problems. He had no empathy for his other team members. And in fact, it got so bad, he lashed out at a few of my other employees, and eventually I pulled him aside and said, "Look, I'm sorry. You're an amazing engineer, but you're a terrible employee. You're going to have to go." So I fired him, and it was a horrible experience. He broke down into tears, and we had this whole thing. And many years later, we met up for a coffee, and we kind of talked through it. And he'd kind of gone through this whole personal journey and improved. What I came to realize out of that experience was that a great coder is not someone that can write an entire Ruby app on a weekend. A great coder is not someone that can improve your database query speed from 500 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds. Sure, there's elements of those technical skills that you always look out for, but a great coder is somebody that can work well in the team, can ask questions, can help their fellow team members, can show empathy for the other members in their group, is willing to keep learning, and is willing to accept that not everybody necessarily understands things as well as they do, perhaps. Accepting that you may know something that somebody else doesn't, and vice versa, that they may know something that you don't, is a really important part of that process. Everybody else on your team has something that they know that you don't, probably. And I think we can learn from everybody. And I think, once again, that comes down to empathy, making sure that we don't kind of get caught up in our own abilities and our own ego. And that's, I think, for some people, that can be pretty challenging. But then you've got to think about that. If you're ever in a position where you're hiring people, make sure you're hiring for those soft skills first, and then worry about the technical skills later.
Yeah, I wish all hiring managers thought that way.
Yeah, it's a really good
It's taken
point.
me a few years to work it out.
I actually worked in public education also, and this is something that we talk about a lot because I worked in urban public education where, it's like we're trying to turn our schools around and improve education. And a big thing they talk about is mindset, and it's why some kids feel like they can never pass a test and never do well in school, but it's also why you get like the brilliant jerk, right? The one that thinks that they're super smart, but then they also won't take risks, or they're always trying to make themselves look smart. And so how do you actually select for people who have more of a growth mindset, who are more about or more able to accept that they have more things to learn, or that they have faults, because they're really just in it more for the learning and less for trying to make themselves look good.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I have another very, very short anecdote I'd like to share actually on that. If I look back at my 22, 23-year-old self, I was probably pretty sure of myself. I was probably a little too sure of myself. My business partner and I had raised money for our company, and we had a chairman of the board that was established by the investment firm. And I hated this guy. I hated him so much. We didn't see eye to eye on anything, and we had some terrible fights and disputes. But what I realized when I looked back on that experience a few years later, I realized he was actually probably one of the most important people I've ever had in my life, despite the fact that I hated him. But the reason he was so important, and the reason that I didn't like him very much, was because he challenged me. He made me realize my mistakes, and he made me look myself in the mirror and force myself to be more humble and more embracing of what I didn't know. And I think that was actually, as painful as it was, an incredibly valuable experience for me. I think the times that you learn the most about yourself and the most about how to interact with other people is when you are willing to accept that you're wrong. And we will all be wrong a lot. That's the nature of technology, that's the nature of life. But there are those that just simply, for whatever reason, are utterly unwilling to accept that and kind of learn from their mistakes. And sadly, I just don't think those people will ever kind of grow and evolve as human beings, which is very sad.
Also, so I know we're starting to get towards the end here, and I'd just like to give everyone a chance to ask maybe a couple more questions. This has been a great vein of discussion. I'll make sure that everyone has a voice.
I guess I had two questions. This is Andrew, by the way.
Sure.
My first question is, how common is pair programming in the industry in the context of like Agile? And my second question is I know I guess in the tech industry and how it's growing, and in terms of like the context of hiring, there's a lot of there's difference between startups and big companies, and they ask for different levels of experience, where like some startups 5+ years of production experience versus sometimes some companies ask for 2. How do you get, like, I guess my question for that is, how do you get your first step through the door, like as someone from the context of like a coding, like a coding camp, I guess you should say, and how
Sure.
Yeah, that's my question.
Two great questions. I'll start with the pairing one first. Pairing is really common. It is very common in different firms and agencies and companies, and you'll see some companies at one end of the spectrum where their entire workforce pairs all of the time. That's kind of an extreme case, but it does happen. There's an organization based out of San Francisco. They have offices all around the world now called Pivotal Labs. They are huge proponents of pair programming, and I've met their CEO, and I actually got an opportunity to pair with him, and that's it's a core part of their whole philosophy at Pivotal. I think normally where you see pair programming is in the context of, I'm kind of stuck on this problem, or I'm not quite sure how to solve this problem or approach it. I'm going to find somebody else that I can buddy up with and nut it out. And sometimes it might be someone that maybe knows that problem space really well, or it's someone that can mentor you, or maybe it's just a colleague that you value their input and you'd like to team up on something. Pair programming can be a lot of work, but it's very, very valuable. Actually, just as a quick side, and this is a shameless plug, I apologize, but if you take a look at Coder TV, codr.tv, we actually did a little episode on pair programming. It's part of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Coders. So yeah, feel free to check that out. And end of shameless free plug. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes.
Okay, great. So coming to your second question, was kind of talking about experience and how do you break into the industry when, it's that age-old problem, right? They ask for 2 years experience, but how do you get the 2 years experience? And so you've got the 2 years experience. It's recursion. The first thing I would say is that the people that are typically asking for that very often don't really understand what it is they're hiring for. It's often recruiters. They may not be coders. They may not be technical. And they don't know how to ask. The only metric they have to understand how good a coder somebody is how long have they been doing it. I know coders that have been coding for 10 years that they're really not that great. And then I know coders that have been coding for a year and they're incredible. Like they just pick it up. They're like a duck to water. So I think that whole idea that the amount of time you've been coding is directly related to how good a coder you are is actually flawed. Sometimes it can be related, but there's no guarantee. So the question then becomes, how do you deal with that when recruiters or companies are asking for that kind of experience? My first response is find the champion. Find somebody in the organization that you can become friendly with. Maybe see if they're willing to have a coffee with you or a tea if that's more your thing. And get to know them, ask them for advice, explain to them what it is you're doing and what it is you're trying to achieve. You can do this also by getting along to meetups. So meetup.com, like I mentioned before, has meetups in just about every city in the world. There's JavaScript meetups, Ruby meetups, Python meetups, whatever. Get along to those and try to network. Because what I found, actually through one of my more recent startups, it's called codehire.com, what I found doing research for that is that the vast majority of good hires are made through referrals and through a network. Those folks that kind of come in cold and apply for a role just on a website or on a recruiting site tend not to be that good at hires. And that's not necessarily because there's anything wrong with the people who are applying, but because it's very hard to gauge a good fit if you've never met this person. You don't know what their skills are, you don't know what their background is, you don't know what their passion is. And so good hiring managers tend to hire from their network or from referrals first and foremost. So that would be my biggest piece of advice on that front. Go and network, go and get to know people. And I think the opportunities will come to you once that starts to happen.
Cool, thank you.
No problem.
Does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
Maybe I think maybe we have time for one more question from the group here, or from outside. I know the Q&A app hasn't been functioning properly here, but I haven't also found any other questions on our other forums. So does anyone else have one more?
So just while, if you folks are thinking, sorry, I was just going to mention, if you'd like to connect with me on Twitter after this, the Twitter handle, actually, perhaps Erik, you can share it, but feel free to reach out to me on Twitter and I'll be happy to help you with any other questions you might have.
Absolutely.
A quick question. So how do you stay relevant as a programmer? And what challenges do you foresee in the industry for the next 2-3 years for programmers, developers?
Good questions. So I think relevancy comes from living and breathing it. I think it can be incredibly difficult to stay relevant in the software industry if you don't continue to keep up with trends. Like I say, I've been coding for 20 years, but there's now like so much in the industry that I don't understand and I don't know about. I've recently, the last 3 or 4 years, I've started becoming much more aware of things like AngularJS and React and different front-end frameworks, whereas historically I was much more of kind of a back-end programmer. I think what you should do is, it kind of comes back to what I was saying a little earlier. Be part of a network, get along to community events, and try to understand what people are interested in. What's the kind of the latest language that people are talking about, and what are they using it in their offices or their companies, and try to talk to them and understand what kinds of languages they think that you might want to pursue. Of course, one of the big challenges, and this kind of comes back to what Sia was talking about before, say if you're a woman and you want to go on maternity leave, or hey, if you're a dad and you want to go on paternity leave, which I think is an awesome idea, going away from the workforce for a couple of years can be really hard to try to get back into it. So if you find yourself in that situation, if there's nothing else that you do, try to stay involved in those community events. I think that's probably more important than even coding itself in some cases, is being aware of who's who in the community and knowing what kind of languages to pursue and what companies are hiring and all that kind of stuff. Sorry, I'll have to refresh my memory on the second question. I got a bit off topic there.
What challenges do you foresee in the industry in the next 2 to 5 years for a programmer?
So I think the industry as a whole has challenges in finding enough people, which is probably not a challenge actually for the coders themselves. You'll probably find it pretty easy so long as you have basic competency to find a role in the next 2 to 3 years. I think we're at an interesting kind of crossroads in terms of technology, though. We sort of have come from this world of PHP applications, Python applications, Ruby on Rails applications, just kind of static applications. And in the last couple of years, there's been this huge amount of interest in front-end frameworks like AngularJS, React, and so forth. And actually, there's a huge jump from building a back-end app to a kind of a single-page application like in AngularJS. And I understand you're all about to go into AngularJS training in the coming weeks. Is that right, Erik?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be I think it's extremely exciting. I love AngularJS. It's probably going to be pretty challenging for you. So I wish you all the best in that. But I think that's actually a broad challenge on a broader scale. So if you want to become an expert in software programming, do you then decide, okay, I'm going to know Ruby on Rails and I'm going to know it so well I can dream it? Or am I going to learn AngularJS and do the same thing? Or am I going to learn a little bit of both? And I think that's probably actually one of the biggest challenges for a coder that's kind of, especially one that's starting out, but this also applies to more experienced coders, is working out which languages to specialize in, and also how much of a kind of variety of languages and frameworks do they get to know. So personally, I've decided that Ruby on Rails is kind of my specialty. I have been working really hard on my competency in front-end JavaScript frameworks and responsive design and CSS frameworks and things like that. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I've decided I'm not going to invest my time in at the moment. So, for example, native iOS apps or native Android apps, I've kind of played with them. But in order for you to become quite competent in a couple of, maybe 2 or 3 different areas, you need to specialize to some extent. And so the big challenge is trying to decide which areas to specialize in. And I don't have a really good answer for you, but I like everything I've said, I encourage you to get to know other people who work in the industry, and they may have some advice for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Cool. Thank you so much. I think we're kind of down at the end here. I just wanted to maybe go out on a piece of advice. If you were sitting in these seats, if you were listening to this and you were just kind of getting started on your career, maybe you're putting yourself in their shoes, or maybe you're putting yourself back in your own shoes, in an area unrelated necessarily to the focus on the actual code. What advice can you give yourself just in more of a meta level as a growing and budding programmer?
What's interesting to me, actually, I discovered so much more about the world and about my knowledge in general when I started listening to podcasts. It sounds like a really obscure piece of advice, but I think that the message comes from this idea that learning is something that you need to be good at if you're a programmer, because the industry continues to change and you want to continually learn. But learning doesn't necessarily have to be about, learning code. Learning can be anything, and I find that if you learn something about a whole new topic, something totally different, you'll actually find that you're doing two things. A, you're becoming a better learner, but B, you can start to kind of assimilate different ideas and different ways of thinking into the way that you code. And so personally, the way that I have done that is I've gone onto iTunes and I've just downloaded all these podcasts, and there's all kinds of interesting things. There's like Radiolab from New York, and there's 99% Invisible in California, and then there's Freakonomics Radio and TED Talks and all this kind of stuff. And I find that there's just so many interesting things to learn and so many different perspectives on the world. And I think that it makes you a more rounded person, but it makes you a better person that's able to learn how to code as you go along. So that's the biggest piece of advice I have.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan, for sharing your time with us from halfway across the world.
You're very welcome.
Everyone else who's been listening, whether you're close or far, all of you, thank you so much for helping out, and I think that's a wrap for tonight. So have a good one.
Nice talking to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.